updating. Something that would be a very straightforward part of what we want to do in terms of debug display, that's very simple. So if I take a look at how these are being displayed right now, we can kind of see debug cycle counter. Here is how that gets dumped out right at the moment. And so what I want to do is kind of start down that path. And I want to imagine that we had a way to print this out. Now there's two parts of printing this out that we have to write. One of them we care about right now, and one of them we don't. So the two parts of it are, first of all, we need a way to actually put fonts on the screen. That's the part we care about. And then there's the part about how to actually convert numbers, like numerical values, into text. And that part we don't care about quite yet. We will care about it once we actually want the debug counters to actually start printing. But for the moment, we don't care about that because we're working on the font part of things first. So what I want to do is I want to take this routine, right, that you can see right here. And what I want to do is I want to go into our game and I want to start printing, I want to start imagining, I guess, since I can't quite print it yet, I want to start imagining that I was able to print this out to the screen. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a little function here in handmade.cpp. And again, handmade.cpp is kind of just our dumping ground for things that don't have a home yet. Things kind of grow in handmade CPP, and then we move them out into their own files sort of as we determine what forms a coherent system and what stuff we want to think about together, right? So if I have this here, I'm going to just call this overlay cycle counts or something, or cycle counters. And so the overlay cycle counters function, obviously it needs to take the game memory so that it can loop over these things. And when it loops over these things, we don't have the ability of doing output debug string because now we're not in the platform layer. And so what we want to do is replace those calls to output debug string, right, with our own way, our own font overlay system. So in order to do that, obviously we need a renderer, like we need to be able to target a bitmap and all these other sorts of things. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to go ahead and assume that we're going to be past a renderer here, right? One of our render groups, something that can do that rendering, right? So in here, I'm just going to assume temporarily, okay, we're going to get a render group, and the render group, right, is the thing that will do the output for us. And so when we come through here, we're going to want to do basically the same stuff. So what I'll probably say is, well, for now, let's just assume that we have something that's like, render string or something like this, right? And you can pass a string to be rendered. So I want to do a render string. I think we were doing push basically, right? So maybe push text is a better one. Something like that. And so here's my render group. And when I do these debug cycle counts thing, right, I'm just kind of going to push that text on there. The thing that it doesn't really say, it doesn't really specify, is where the text should actually show up, right? So that's kind of a little thing that we kind of going to need to address, right? So we'll talk about that in a second. But for now, let's just assume that we're going to have some way of dumping that text. We loop over the counters that we have. And just like before, we just check, if this counter ever got hit, then what we're going to do is we're going to print it out. We don't have any way to do this yet. We don't have a way to do this sprintf because that's, again, a Windows platform thing that's happening there, a CRT Windows sort of thing. And we're trying not to use any libraries in Handmade here, so we don't want to call that. So what I'd rather do is I'd rather temporarily say, okay, until we have a replacement for that, what I'm going to do is assume that text buffer thing, right? I'm going to assume that text buffer part of it is actually just going to be whatever the debug counter part of it was. Oh, wait, but these don't even have any names, do they? That's kind of weird. I guess we never gave these names. We give these things. All we would have to do is just do something like name table and say, all right, well, we know that these counters all have specific values, so we're just going to go ahead and tell you what the names are right here. Again, not what we would like to do long term, because we don't want to have to be involved in the sort of fussy management of these things. So we'll look for a better solution to that later. There's a lot of things we could do to fix that, but again, not really important right now. And we'll use the counter index that we're talking about, and that will allow us to go ahead and push that string on there. And then what we want to do, again, besides just the naming part, is we would like to eventually tackle the part where we print it out so that we can actually see the values of those performance counters. That's the end goal. A lot of this stuff we're going to start hoisting out because the only reason those debug cycle counters were sort of getting dealt with at all in the platform layer was because that's the only place that we could output them. So as we're sort of, like those of you who've been watching know, in our sort of to-do list situation as we're going through things here. Oh, hey, look at that. We sort of finished that one. This debug cycle counters, we'll be adding lots of stuff like this, not in like a platform layer or anything like that. Texts, and then eventually we'll sort of tackle this guy. But for now, this will just do that kind of simple printout thing. Now, like I said, what we don't quite know here is we don't actually know where those text things go, is the thing, right? We don't actually know where those are being sort of pushed. And, right, because normally there'd be like some coordinates here or something like that. Now, what we could do, obviously, is we could introduce something here where I have to start specifying coordinates and all that stuff. But that's not particularly good because, you know, if we're talking about debug code, I don't want to have to spend a lot of mental energy or pass a bunch of things through my code in order to do debug printouts. So what I'd rather do is make it so that the thing that draws fonts in the engine for debug stuff is actually like pretty clearly labeled as such. So instead of a push text, I'm going to go ahead and say that we have something else, which is kind of like a way of saying that I'm doing like a line of debug text, right? And then I'm just going to expect at the moment, I'm just going to expect that the render group has these debug services built into it, so it just knows that every time I output a debug text line, I kind of just want them to like feed down the screen. And later we'll kind of maybe augment that with some better ways of saying what gets categorized in different ways, so when we have too much of this stuff, it doesn't just kind of overflow things. But at the moment, like, I just want to start basically with that. Whereas if we were doing something more for graphics work, which we will do a little bit with our fonts because we're probably going to display strings once in a while in the actual game, right? That would be something that we'd want to do with coordinates, like put the text here. So what do I want this debug text line to look like, right? So if I go into handmade render group, you can kind of see here that you know, we've got this render transform that is used for debugging that's separate, right? So it's not using the same one as for the game. It's using like a separate render transform that it you know, does in a completely different way or something like that, right? And furthermore, I'm thinking that probably what we would wonder too, now that I think about it, I wonder too if we want to just make that render group be implicit, knows it can get at. Then what I would like to do here, right, is I'd like to have something that was like a global variable, which is like a render group, which is like the debug render. Have to be a render group. It could be its own like sort of debug gathering thing. But for now, I'm going to make it a render group. You know what? I think just thinking about it in my head, I feel like we're going to want it to be separate because, like, here's what I'm thinking. What I'm thinking is, suppose we have like lots of code and all the code has debug output in it. Obviously, you're going to want to be able to pick what debug you're viewing and what debug you're not viewing. So, you know, one way you do that is it just gets buffered up in this debug sys thing, and then you can like pick which one you're viewing. Throws out all the calls that are, you know, would be filtered out by the current selection of what you want to view. So we could still do it as something that immediately kind of renders to a render group. So I don't know. It's a pretty tough, who knows? All right. So if we have our debug render group here, then we're just going to assume that when we come before anything